Next speaker is, again, we need somebody with a British accent, this time further from the north, so let's see if you find the difference between those. It's Rachel Andrew, and Rachel has been around for a long time and being very, very active in the CSS working groups. And she can be incredibly smug right now because she's been telling for years that CSS grids is the way to go, and everybody's talking about CSS grids now. Everybody's getting excited about them. So you hear it directly from the source, from the lady who's been a fan of CSS grids for a long, long time, Rachel Andrew.
Hey, hello. So when I agreed to do this talk, I gave a title. I said, laying out the future with Grid and Flexbox. But as events transpired, perhaps a better title might have been this. I've been talking, as Christian mentioned, about CSS Grid for, well, over 4 years. I've been standing on stages for at least 3 years telling people that this is coming soon. Honestly, I'm not some sort of crazy lady just imagining this thing. It's going to happen. But it was kind of future technology. It was in browsers, it was behind flags. You had to enable flags to play around with the stuff I was talking about. So it was kind of always soon. This is going to happen soon. And then just last month, this happened. And in a completely unprecedented move. Something like this has never happened before. For all of these browsers to implement something of the scale of grid layout, really at more or less the same time. And I've just come from Event Apart, which is why I was only here for day 2 of this conference, where Edge announced that they too are updating their implementation. Which will give us the whole lot, which will be fantastic. We'll have CSS Grid in all of those browsers. So this talk is very much about how we can actually start to use CSS Grid, despite the fact that there are old browsers out there, how we can actually start to use this in our work and solve real problems that we have. And this is me, and this is why I talk about this stuff. I'm an advanced expert for the CSS working group, and I do other things. I have a CMS product, is actually how I pay the bills. And you can find me by those places online. And yes, I am a very old nerd. I've been doing this for about 20 years. I still love it. And about the CSS working group, most people there are representatives of browser vendors. So they work for browser vendors. They might be an engineer themselves, or they're a DevRel person. And there's other people who use CSS, people who use CSS in EPUB, for example. There are very few of us who are actually just web developers like myself. So kind of I see my remit there is to represent us, the people who build websites. And I'm always looking for the use cases, the things you can't do, the things that are hard, so that when we ask those questions in the working group, what do web developers want, I know. And it's not just, I'm not just looking at myself and my own work to answer that question. And more on that later. But I can't teach you all of CSS Grid layout, certainly at the moment. And if any of you come into the workshop tomorrow, we'll be doing a lot more. So I'm going to kind of answer the top questions that I get. So what is Grid? Why is it different to Flexbox? And how do we actually get started using this? What's a roadmap to actually start using Grid? And of course, we're going to talk about old browsers because we haven't been able to kind of blow them all up when we've started with the new browsers that have got Grid. They're still going to be there. I also want to talk a little bit of how can we get browsers to implement new stuff like Grid? How do we get the things we want into the platform? So, when I talk about Grid layout, the helpful people on Twitter who like to tell me things tell me that Flexbox exists and why we need this new layout method because we have Flexbox. There's also this kind of strange assumption that the CSS working group are creating competing layout methods, like some sort of CSS layout deathmatch, which will win, Grid or Flexbox. And it's not like that at all because they're very different. The answer that's defined in the spec is that Flexbox is for one-dimensional layout. And Grid is two-dimensional. So if you want to lay things out as a row or a column, then that's what Flexbox is for. So this is a Flexbox example. I've got a bunch of stuff in a container, and it's laid out using Flexbox. It's allowed to wrap. And you can see as that is wrapping, what's happening is the final item, or the final 2 items, when there's not an equal number on the bottom, it spreads out right across the row. And that's because each row is becoming its own shiny new Flex container, and space distribution happens across that row. So Grid is for two-dimensional layout. That means rows and columns at the same time. That's pretty much the same layout using grid. But as you can see, things line up in their columns as well as being in the rows. So that's two-dimensional, rows and columns at the same time. That layout is done with a little bit of grid magic there. You see that grid template columns definition. We're saying repeat autofill, so fill as many columns as we need. And then we've got this min-max thing. So we say min-max, a minimum of 200 pixels, and a maximum of 1 fraction unit, 1 FR. And so that means that any leftover space is distributed amongst the columns. You'll find quite a lot of interesting new bits of CSS for defining columns because you've got a different problem once you're defining things on a column basis rather than targeting the items. So you might be thinking, well, I can get that second layout with Flexbox by adding widths to my items. And actually, that's the exact point at which you probably need to think about using grid. If you're knobbling the flexibility of Flexbox, if you're trying to make it into a grid, you probably actually want to be using grid layout if that is available to you. Another way to look at it is this. Flexbox works from the content out, and grid works from the container in. So if you've got a collection of things, and they're all different sizes, and you just want to let the content dictate the size of the items, and you want to space them out evenly, that's a really good Flexbox example. This list of ingredients for a recipe here, I've got equal space between the items, no matter how long the text in the items is. Or perhaps you want to let some things get bigger than other things, but still take that content size as the sort of key thing to work from. So you might be growing and shrinking in proportion. That's a good Flexbox use case and would give you something like this. Now, grid works from the container in. So you say, I've created a grid. It's got tracks. They're this size. And then my content is going to sit into the grid cells that I've created there. So this is a 3-column track grid. I'm using that FR unit again. So that's a fraction of the available space in the grid container. I've got 3 of them. So we split that space into 3, and we share it out, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. We get 3 equal columns. And the content sits in the equal columns. I don't need to apply anything to the item itself. They just sit into the spaces that I've made. And if we'd like some of those tracks larger than others, again, we define that when we create the tracks rather than putting anything on the item as we would with Flexbox. So here I've got a track of 2 FR, one of 1 FR, and one of 2 FR. The available space is divided into 5 and then shared out in proportion. Again, nothing is added to the items, it's added to the tracks. The items just fit in. And this is really important. I think the reason I get asked this question a lot is that all of our other layout methods deal with the item. We add sizing to the item, and then we try and shape the layout around it by way of other items also having sizing. Grid's different. Grid works on the container. So for example, if we're floating things, we add widths. Inline block is exactly the same. You need to add a width to say how big it's going to be in proportion to the other things. You need to work out those proportions often. And even with Flexbox, although we add Flexbox to the container, if you want to change the sizing of the stuff inside the container, the individual items, again, you are going to add a width to the item, or you're going to play with the flex basis size to get that sizing. So grid is just different. We do our grid creation on the container, and there are ways for the things inside the container to affect that sizing, but they're going to affect the whole track. If you put something with a width into a track that is auto-sized, for example, the track will expand to take that item, but it's going to expand all the way up the track. It's not going to be able to make a strange shape to make room for that thing. It's a grid. It's always going to stay regular. So grid is all about containers. And once you know this, the decision about whether to use grid or Flexbox becomes a lot easier, because it's, do I want to control the items and their size, or do I want to control the thing that they're sat in? And that's a really big difference between the two. You might have a single track grid, but it makes more sense to work on the container than it is to actually work on the items inside. And obviously, grid has extra features involved. It lets you layer items, so 2 items can basically occupy the same space, and we can stack them up. It gives us full control of negative space in designs because we can put something into a row with nothing above it if we want to, and it's not going to rise up in the way that it would with floats. And there's all sorts of interesting things in grid, like the dense packing mode, which lets you backfill gaps in a densely packed grid of images, for example. So if you want to pick Flexbox, think about your content being a row or a column. Think about having the size of items dictating their layout, and distributing space is a key Flexbox thing. If you start trying to control the rows and columns at the same time, you probably want grid, and you know you're doing that because you're adding widths to flex items or adding a flex basis that is precisely calculated. And then if you want to have control of the layout from the parent, and also if things need to occupy the same space or overlap, to do that in Flexbox, you're going to have to use negative margins and sort of pull things around, whereas you can do that very easily with grid. So that's why we've got grid. That's the sort of different things that grid does and the different approach it takes. So how do we actually start to use grid in production? Now, the examples I'm going to show you are sort of taken from an upcoming redesign of my own site. I feel like I ought to kind of put my money where my mouth is and redesign my site using grid. So I've started playing around with some examples, but like most things, my own site comes way at the bottom of the queue of anything else that I'm supposed to be doing. So I've put some examples up on CodePen that are some of the things I've been playing around with in the pattern library tool that I use, which is Fractal. So this is a screenshot taken out of Fractal. It's a bunch of boxes, because basically my site is just a collection of boxes. It always has been, because I use it to try and collect together all the things that I do. So there's blog posts, and there's podcasts I've been on, and there's talks I'm doing. So I've got a bunch of boxes, and so I wanted to carry on that theme and design some different types of boxes using grid layout to go into a big listing layout. So I picked out one of those boxes, this featured item. There's an image behind it, and then we've got some text, a heading, and some content. And I like to start working with components. I like to break everything down into components in the pattern library and target each thing at a time. I find that's a much easier way to deal with browser compatibility, for example, rather than looking at a completely blown apart layout. So I thought I'd start with this item. So here's my markup. I've got a wrapper, this class of box feature, and inside we've got an image there, and we've got a heading, and we've got the content. So that's fairly standard markup for this kind of thing. So this is the container box feature. That's the box, this is feature box, and I'm saying display grid. The grid gap property gives us a gap between the different cells, acting as a gutter. And then I'm saying grid template columns repeat 6 times 1FR. And that repeat is just a handy way of writing out 1FR, 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 1FR. So we could repeat chunks of the track listing. So if you're doing a sort of big multi-column grid, you've probably got the same thing. You just want to repeat over and over. And that can be one value or several. It doesn't matter. So as I mentioned, that fraction unit is defining a fraction of the available space in the grid container. I've now got 6 column tracks. And if we have a look at the component now, it looks like this. And the lines, you can see the shading, you can see on the screen there, that's been put on by the Firefox Grid Inspector, because by default, Grid doesn't make any lines. You can't see anything where those tracks are. So I'm using a tool which is in Firefox. If you inspect anything with a grid, if you go to the container, there's a little icon that looks like a little waffle. If you click that, you'll be able to see the grid tracks, which is really useful. And I've got those tracks on a lot of my examples, so you can actually see how things are in the grid. So what you can see here is auto placement. We've got 3 items, 3 child items of that parent. They immediately have become grid items, because that's what happens if you say display grid. Just like when you say display flex, things become flex items. And they're sitting 1 in each track, in the first 3 tracks of the grid. Now, that's not what I want, but we're starting to see grid layout taking effect here. So we can now position the items. So here I'm using line-based positioning. I'm positioning my image first. I'm going to stretch it over several tracks of the grid. I'm saying start on line 1, column line 1. Then after the /, I'm saying -1, which will actually be the far right line in my case, because I'm working in English, which is a left-to-right language. And I'm saying grid row 1 to 4. So those lines respect writing mode. For me, working in English, column line 1 is on the left, -1 on the right. That would be reversed if you were working in a right-to-left language. Our new CSS specs care about writing mode, which is why you see things like start rather than left, for example. We're worrying about actually which way round the document is depending on the writing mode, which makes things an awful lot more complicated. And sometimes people think, why are the CSS working group doing this? Because if you always work in a left-to-right language, it's not obvious why that's the case. And older specs do work with actual positioning. We say, you know, left for absolute positioning or whatever. So that's something that's changing in CSS. There's something else is happening there. I didn't actually create any rows in my grid. You can create, obviously you create column tracks with grid template columns. You create rows with grid template rows. If you place an item outside of that, now that might be because you actually place something with positioning properties outside, or you've just got more items and they fill into the grid and grid keeps creating tracks for them. That's called the implicit grid, the grid that you haven't explicitly created with your grid definition, but the one that is being created so you don't end up with just a big mess of everything stacked up. So having created our image there, we've got this. So you can see again, I've got the Firefox Grid Inspector on, and so you can see the tracks where that is being sat on the grid. And the rest of the content is displaying below, because auto placement finds some stuff that hasn't been positioned, and so it just pops it into a cell, so we don't get anything overlapping that we don't want. So I'm now going to position that content. Again, I'm using that line-based positioning, and I'm placing the items on the grid. I'm placing them into the same cells that that image is also occupying. So we're layering those things on the grid. And we get that. And the URL, all the slides have got links to the actual CodePen examples, so you can have a look at them later rather than trying to take photos of all the code. So we end up with that. And you can see with the grid highlighter how those things are actually sat in the tracks of the grid. So that positioning, it works just like absolute positioning. If you've got a bunch of absolute positioned items, the things lower down the source are going to stack up over the top of the things that come higher up. And you can control that with z-index. Exactly the same with grid. You can change how things stack up using z-index. So there's quite a lot of nice stuff you can do by layering things into different cells of the grid. So this little item has actually shown us quite a few of the things that we have available to us in grid layout. We used FR units and repeat notation. You saw how grid auto-places items if we don't do anything with them. We've covered the implicit and explicit grid. We've seen how line-based positioning works. And you know that grid respects writing mode. We've also used some of the box alignment properties. I stretched that image, and they're the same as in Flexbox. It's actually a different spec, the box alignment spec, which has taken all of the nice alignment stuff, the stuff that lets you center things in Flexbox, taken out and put into a new spec so we can use it in other specs. At the moment, it's been used in grid layout. There's absolutely no reason, and the spec defines how it could be used in other types of layout too. So we actually may well be able to center things without needing to turn them into flex items first in the very near future, which would be nice. So there's my featured item. It's going to sit there in my grid. My other items are really just boxes. There's nothing very complicated about them. So what I want to do is to be able to position those items into my grid. But what I don't want to do is have to carefully place each item, because I don't know how many items I'm going to have on each page. I've got all this different content. Some of it is sort of being pulled in from other sources. I just want boxes to be able to flow into my content, but I want a bit of control. I want to be able to make some boxes bigger than others because they're featured. And maybe older items I want to make a bit smaller on the grid. So I kind of want to use auto placement. I want to let grid place things, but I want some control over the items. So this is the listing. This is the wrapper around all of that content. So again, we say display grid, make it a grid layout. And then I say repeat 12 times, making a 12-column grid this time, again with a grid gap. So ultimately, what I'm going for is this. I want my items sat in that 12-column grid so they'll all nicely line up. But having done that, auto placement takes effect. And what we actually get is this, which is what you'd expect with grid layout. It's going to try and stuff everything into a track on the grid. So we want to start to control that. Now first, I'm going to place the sort of top of the grid. I want to actually control that. I've got a title that I want to go top left, and I've got that feature box that I created that I want to go on the right. So I'm just placing that on the grid using those line-based positioning properties once again. And that gives us this. So we're getting there. We've still got the things below, which are all being sort of stacked up, lined up there, but the things at the top are all working out. So I want Grid to carry on doing that auto placement thing. I just want to control how many tracks things sit across. So we use this sort of shorthand. We can say box newer. Start on grid column auto, which is just where it would start if it was using auto placement, but span 4 tracks. And then if it's a box that's got some media in, it's a taller box, I want grid row n to span 2. And that's kind of 2 ways of achieving the same thing. And if I want to use the shorthand, which has both start and end, I need to use auto as the start. If I just want to use the end property, so grid row end, I can just say span 2. And I've got some smaller boxes that are older, so I'm going to make those span 3 tracks. And we get this, which you can see at the URL, of the track. So as things are being placed, we're going through auto placement, it places an item, it knows it needs to span 4 tracks, so it gives it 4 tracks. It's not going to create an overlap. So when after its next auto-placed item needs to go on the line after that, it also needs to span 4 tracks, and so on. And so we're using auto-placement, but we're also getting some control over items. And this is pretty neat. You can do a lot of stuff. For instance, you've got a gallery of portrait and landscape images. So I want all my landscape images to span 2 tracks, because that will kind of sort out the proportions of them. You can start to apply rules to certain things in your layout, still rely on auto placement and how that can do a lot of work for you, but then also tailor how things are placed. There's lots and lots of listing examples that are really sort of solved by this use case. Now, all of that was at my widest breakpoint. I was thinking of a nice big listing, but it's pretty easy to make grid layout responsive. I mean, it's flexible by nature with the fraction unit. That stops us having to calculate percentages. It's just nice and flexible, nice flexible grids. And you can redefine either your grid definition, so you could change how many columns and rows you've got, or you can actually just use your same track listing, but then reposition where things are on the grid. And that's the approach that I've taken. So for mobile, I'm going to have the title span right across the grid. I'm keeping my 12 columns, but I want everything to span over. And then as we get wider, so to start with, I might have it spanning 6 tracks. Then as it gets really wide, I go back to 4. And we can also change how the boxes auto-place. At narrower layouts, we'll span 6 tracks, so we'll end up with 2 boxes next to each other. And then as we go wider, we go to the view I had with 3 boxes in a row. And so this is the responsive example. You can see 2 of those examples there. We've got the one on the left, I've got the auto-placed boxes there, spanning 6 tracks. And as I say, you can go and have a look at that at the URL and have a play around with it. So that's just some of the neat things that are part of the grid spec. And there's an awful lot to it. And there's links in my resources where you can actually sort of see all these different features broken down. However, the old browsers. These things are always with us, and we know that even though with Grid shipping into all of those browsers in March and coming soon in Edge, maybe by the end of the year, it might be that your sites have 60, 70% of people with Grid support. I wouldn't be surprised about that at all with evergreen browsers, but there are going to be old browsers, and they're going to be around for a long time. We know that. And it's very difficult to say, oh, well, I'm going to have no layout for older browsers. That's a very hard thing to do, and it's why new layout methods take a long time to catch on. However, defined in the spec is how Grid interacts with other layout methods, which means it works very, very nicely as an enhancement. So you don't need to build 2 layouts, and you certainly don't need to completely fork your code in order to use Grid, particularly if you just use it to enhance small components rather than sort of taking your whole design and laying that at the hands of Grid and having to do an awful lot of rewriting of stuff. So this is our listing page if we don't have Grid and we've got no layout. It's just laying out one thing after the other as you'd expect. So this is pretty easy to create a fallback layout for. In my case, if this is my site, it's mostly web designers who come to my site, so I can probably think they've probably got Flexbox if they haven't got Grid. So Flexbox and Grid work really nicely as a sort of fallback. So here I'm saying display flex, and I'm creating a sort of wrapped flex layout. Now, if something is a flex item, and then I say display grid, if the browser supports grid, it becomes a grid item. I can just have the two things there in my listing. As long as they're in the right order, so that the cascade works, that's going to work absolutely fine. And then the actual flex properties I've applied to the children of listing, they'll be ignored once it becomes a grid item. Nothing weird will happen because they're not supported by grid layout, so they're just thrown away. And that's defined in the spec. One thing I will need to do is remove that margin I've applied for flex items, because once I've got a gap, I don't want that margin there. And this is where something else which is defined in the spec, which is a new specification, feature queries. Feature queries allow you to detect whether the browser says it has support for a feature. It's a bit like Modernizer baked into CSS, baked into the browser. So if you've ever used Modernizer, you'll understand what it does. And if you've ever used a media query, you know how to use it. And the nice thing about feature queries is they have really great browser support. And it doesn't matter about old browsers, because what we're doing is saying, here, do this old thing, but if you have support, do the new thing. So we can do the old thing for the old browsers and not worry that they don't support grid and they don't support feature queries. Well, that's fine. So this is how we use it. So we don't need to remove those flex properties particularly, but we do want to get rid of the margin. I want to set the margin to 0. So I say at supports, that's the feature query, inside the brackets, display grid. If we support grid, take that margin off, because I'm going to be able to use grid gap, so I don't need the margin. And so this is what we end up with our flex layout. It's not, we could go further than this. You know, you could do a lot more work in your fallback layouts depending on how many people you expect to see them, but this is perfectly acceptable. And we haven't got the layering because we're using Flexbox. One thing I'd like to do is actually just make that, the featured item there, spread out across the top. And we can do that just by giving the box a larger flex basis, as I'm sure you know if you've done any kind of grid with Flexbox in the past. And so there's our flex version alongside our grid version. It's kind of passable. As I say, we could go a bit further than that. But you can see how we can start very simply to build up our layout and use grid as an enhancement. And what we have seen is you don't need a lot of additional CSS to override grid. You don't have to override other things with grid, because you don't have to write everything again. So the things for older browsers, if you're really having to support very old things, if perhaps you're going to use float as a fallback, if something is floated and then it becomes a grid item, float stops having any effect. You don't need to use feature queries to set float none or anything like that. You can just ignore it. Once it becomes a grid item, it stops being floated. Clear is the same. If something is display inline block and becomes a grid item, all the sort of properties and the behavior of inline block stop taking effect, so that's fine. You can just go ahead with your grid and it'll just all work. Display table, the same. That will just continue to, it'll become a grid item. And the anonymous boxes that you get, if you've ever used display table for older browsers to do sort of Flexbox-like things, you get kind of anonymous boxes, the rest of the table, basically. If you make something display table cell, you're going to end up with a box that actually is the table, because that's how the sort of the CSS works. But if it becomes a grid item, that happens before the boxes are generated, so you don't get anything weird sort of hanging around that might cause a styling problem. If you use vertical align with display table or display inline block, that has no effect on a grid item, so you can go ahead and make something a grid item and then say use the box alignment properties to do your alignment. Multi-column layout can be quite useful for some fallbacks for grid layout. That's something that is defined on the container. So if you've got something which has a column count to give you a multi-column layout, and then you later turn that into a grid, all the column count properties and things, they'll just be ignored. And of course, Flexbox, sort of fairly obviously, if something was a flex item, it becomes a grid item, and any flex properties are also ignored. So pretty much, in practice, the overrides inside your feature queries are mostly widths and margins. Because you get issues like this, if you've got something floated and you've given it a width to make its size, and then you turn that into a grid layout, that item becomes a grid item, but it still has the width, because the width is separate to the floating behavior. And that width is then going to be 33% of the grid track it's in, rather than 33% of the container. So you're going to need to set your widths back to auto. If you're getting strange widths happening and you're sort of overriding old layout, then have a look if there's things you need to set to auto. That's usually the case. And it happens with Flexbox as well if you're using Flexbox in enhancement. I made you a cheat sheet there to help. That's got all of these different overrides and things to find, so you can have a look and use that as you're creating layouts and starting to use grid as an enhancement. So what of Edge and IE? Before anyone starts going, oh, you know, they're always the slowest, this spec came from the Microsoft team. We only have grid layout at all because it was implemented in IE10. The original editors of the spec were from Microsoft. And it was because I saw this in IE10, and I thought, this is cool. This is where this whole grid story began. And I don't think we would have grid if it hadn't been for that early work by Microsoft. So currently, the current Edge, until they ship their new implementation, IE10 and 11 have grid. But it's a kind of limited, and it's an older spec, because it's that spec from sort of 2011 or so when they did that original work. And obviously it's moved on, because that was kind of the test case. That was the prototype for grid layout. So it's a simpler specification, but it works. The Edge implementation is currently tied to IE10. It's prefixed, so when Edge ship their new implementation, it won't be prefixed. So you'll always be able to, for instance, use feature queries and still write the MS stuff for IE. It doesn't have auto placement, it doesn't have the grid template areas stuff, but for simple line-based positioning, it works very well. And so you can use the IE implementation as a fallback for old IE browsers going right back to IE10 if you're using grid layout. What I would say is take great care of auto prefixer. The team at Auto Prefixer have done some mapping between new grid and old grid. But the problem is it's not a one-to-one mapping. You can't really just code yourself out of that. You need to make decisions sometimes about how you're going to support it. It's quite different. For very, very simple layouts, Auto Prefixer may give you something useful, but it also may make an awful mess. It's caught me out. Yeah, I've seen it catch other people out. They're like, what on earth's happening to this in Edge? And I'm like, Auto Prefixer is happening to that in Edge. So if you're using Auto Prefixer for other things in your layout, just take care that it's not running over your grid and causing a strange rewriting of properties. So let's go back to this slide. You know, all of those browsers supporting grid, and Edge, which is going to support grid. So how does that even happen? And if you don't care about grid, why hasn't a browser implemented your favorite feature? Why hasn't that happened yet? So ultimately, behind every browser is a business, and they obviously have different things that they care about and that they want to be working on. They're often quite small teams of people working on the engine, so they're making business decisions. But we as the web community have far more influence than you might think in terms of what gets implemented in browsers. So it is really, really important to let them know what you want, and we can do that in a few different ways as a community. Now, obviously, some of the browser vendors have places that you can go. This is Edge. You can go to user voice, and you can vote for features that you want. This mattered for grid. And it means that a lot of the time, the engineers on the browser would love to ship shiny new feature, but they've got to convince their bosses. And so by being able to see that we as the web community want something, and we're going to make a noise about it, that's going to make it easier for not only for them to prioritize their work, but also perhaps to say, hey, you know, this is something that people are really keen on seeing. So do go and vote if browser vendors have that method of doing it or any way of reaching out to them. Go and do that. Let them know the features that you want. But also use features. Use features that are only implemented in one browser where possible. Because this is Microsoft's data on CSS usage on the web platform. They're looking at what we're actually using on our sites to see which things they should be making interoperable. So that's really important. Actually using new features, even if it's just on your personal site, and just as an experiment, that sends a message. It says, we want this, and we're trying to use it, and we can't because you haven't got it in your browser. So do use this stuff. It's not a waste of time to actually be putting stuff into production where you can. So just as part of that, here's something that I really want to see. This, you can see that image with that text all the way wrapped around the outside of it. That's an exclusion. It was actually part of the CSS Shapes spec that was developed by Adobe. And Shapes ended up being implemented. It's in Chrome. I think Firefox is currently implementing it. Exclusions got removed into its own spec. And all it does is define that you've got something positioned by another method, and the text should be able to wrap around it. The other content should wrap around the excluded thing. Little tiny speck. And it becomes very useful in combination with grid layout, because you can position your thing using grid and sort of sit it on top of your content, basically. So it could be maybe a block quote that you want to be sort of half in and half out of your content. Now you position it with grid, and then you use this property, this wrap flow both, is the value there. That's with it's only implemented in Edge at the moment and IE. You're very surprised these things that come through from the Microsoft team. But at the moment, you can see that working in Edge using this wrap flow property. That's something I think would be really, really useful to have in combination with grid. To say, doing things like pull quotes and doing interesting things with images and be able to wrap the text around. Really nice. I'd like more people to talk about exclusions. So if we go to Chrome platform status and have a look at what they say about CSS exclusions, web developers, no signals. And that means really no one's talking about it. I think there's me and a couple of other people have mentioned it, you know? So yes, that's correct at the moment, but we could change that. You know, if more people said, hang on, I've got a use case for this, that would be really, really helpful. So it's stuff like that. If you see features or you know a feature is in one browser and not another, talk about it, make some noise about it, go and vote for it. It does make a difference. And it's not just those things that exist in CSS and haven't been implemented. You can get involved with what happens next with specifications like grid. So here's an example. When people start to use grid, the first thing they run into is they say, and I get this is emailed to me most days, people say, oh, can we style the grid cells themselves? Can we add backgrounds and borders to actually to grid cells? You know, not putting an element in there, but just styling the grid. And unfortunately, no, you can't. That's not something that you can do in level 1 of the spec. So if you run into something like this, you can go to the CSS working group drafts. And this is where we have all the CSS drafts, all the specs that have been worked on are here, and issues are raised against them, just like any open source project. So the members of the CSS working group raise issues, but so do web developers and browser vendors and all sorts of other people. So you can look, you can search the issues, and you can see what there is there for grid. And you can raise your own issues if you want, or you can comment on them. So here's that one about adding backgrounds and borders and things. It's been talked about as grid cell pseudo elements, because we don't have an element to style, so we want some way of styling the backgrounds and so on. So that's there, and if you scroll down that thread, you'll find lots of people commenting and sharing their use cases for this idea, and anyone can do that. And I would love you to do so, because when I'm sat in CSS working group meetings, what happens is people say, well, has anyone seen a use case for this out on the web? Or what do the authors think? You know, what do the web developers think about this? Are they wanting to use this sort of thing? And if we've got these comments, we've got these use cases, just like any bit of software, if you've got the use cases, it not only shows that, yes, we need this thing, but it also shows us how to create the thing, because then we know what use cases we're trying to solve. So, you know, you can always go and see what there is, you know, being posted to the drafts, to the issues there, and you can add your thoughts, and please do. It's there for everyone to get involved with. So there's actually lots of ways to get involved with CSS. You can comment on issues there. You can raise bugs against browsers. Please do. They want you to as well. You know, vote on features when you can. Write about new features, but be nice while you're doing it. You see a lot of very angry people online, you know, assuming that sort of this browser's not implemented something to really ruin your day. That's not the case. You know, the browser engineers, the spec editors work within constraints just like any of us do when we're developing a project. So that said, I really want to celebrate the fact that we got CSS Grid. It's stopped me looking like some sort of strange fantasist, so that's quite good. And I hope I've shown you some of the things that it's going to make easier for us to do. And, you know, do have a look at all those bits of code. And I've also got lots and lots of resources. Gridbyexample.com is my site of worked examples, and there are a whole load of free video tutorials there, really breaking down the spec. I created a great big set of guides for MDN for when Grid launched in Firefox. And if you go to my site, you'll find all sorts of stuff, and you can basically track the history of Grid through the things that I wrote there and how the spec changed. So thank you very much for listening. You'll find slides, code, everything else there, and I'll be around if you want to have a chat to me about Grid. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Join me.
Join you on the couch.
Join us. Excellent. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but aren't table layouts easier?
How many people actually built a table layout? There's quite a few. How many people developed for Netscape 4? Oh, yes, it's an old room.
Now, if I had said that, it would have been a Twitter storm again. Great. It's so good to see something like that coming out after such a while, and there's so many opportunities there. There is a bit of a complexity to it, though. What do you think is the biggest barrier that people have when they start working with grids? What do they expect it to be working like, although it doesn't?
I think people think that we've got masonry there, which we haven't, because masonry is a bit of a... There's actually an issue on the CSS Working Group drafts about masonry-type things, because masonry is actually a bit of a weird hybrid of grid and Flexbox, because you've got things that kind of need to go up into the container where something else is. It's a bit of a weird one. Whether that's something that can be solved through CSS, or whether maybe it's something more that's a kind of a Houdini thing, perhaps, to solve masonry. But that's the one thing, because people look at it, and there are some auto-placement examples that look just like a masonry layout, but it's just because the size of the content or whatever works like that. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that people ask. Yeah.
So one thing about masonry was, though, as it did the layout with JavaScript, it became incredibly slow on scrolling, and then people put backdrops on there and drop shadows and gradients, and basically because they hate browser makers. So do the same problems happen here? A complex grid layout in a scrolling pane on a mobile phone might be a tricky thing, right?
It's pretty performant. I mean, Igalia, who did the Blink implementation, did a bunch of testing on speed. It does depend. There's lots of different ways to size tracks and things. Obviously, if you're sizing things based on your content, that's going to be slower because we've got to figure out what the size of your content is before you can then work out what the track size is. So the more tied down the grid can be, the faster it's likely to be. How much that is in practice, I think it's going to depend on how much content there is, for instance. But certainly there were very good results coming from the stuff that Igalia were talking about.
I found it very interesting to see that floats, for example, are overwritten by grid or discarded. This seems to be the first time in CSS specs for that to happen to me.
Yeah, I mean, the spec does define this stuff because it has to, because otherwise, well, what happens? Do bits of the behavior of something kind of leak into it when it becomes a grid item? And in fact, that is pretty much what we spend most of the CSS Working Group meetings talking about. It's not like, how does this spec work? It's, how does this spec work when someone has defined two different layout methods on the same thing? Which one wins? And do other properties get thrown away? And there's all that sort of stuff. It gets quite complex. It's why specs take a long time to end up out there and usable.
Yeah. Do you think there is, with the grid specs, and I asked you that at another conference a few years ago, and you didn't have an answer then, or you didn't quite want to commit, do you think that with a grid spec in place, we're closer to getting a what you see is what you get editor that actually is not terrible?
I think it would certainly be much more possible, and that's certainly my interest, because way back when I worked with the stuff with the Web Standards Project, I was working with Macromedia to try and make Dreamweaver output not terrible code. That was kind of the remit, because I mean a WYSIWYG editor is always going to have some limitations. The problem with grid and any layout tool is it's very, very easy to end up making your content completely inaccessible, because you can position things anywhere you like inside the container. So, I mean, I keyboard navigate quite a lot, and it's quite easy to end up with things, the sort of disconnect between the visual layout and how you're actually tabbing around between the items. So I think it certainly would make it easier to do a visual tool, because for the first time since table-based layouts, basically, you can say, here is a grid, and I'm going to put things into it, which is exactly what a tool needs to be able to do that sort of work. However, those tools need to be very, very careful that they're not reordering the display, so they just make this awful mess for anyone who's not just using a mouse to get around.
Well, to a degree. I mean, you can do that by hand as well. It's just a matter of flagging it up as a warning when you do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the spec says, that basically visual tools should essentially ask you to reorder the content if you're doing visual reordering, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have your content in a good order. and not kind of break that. But it's a difficult problem because Flexbox to an extent lets you mess around with the order of things, and Grid, obviously, you can do it then in 2 dimensions. So there is that possibility of making a horrible mess with or without an authoring tool. But,
How is the support for developer tools? I mean, you said Firefox has a grid layout
yes.
thing, but it seems to be the only one.
That's the only one as far as I don't know of anyone else doing that. And Firefox have got some new stuff that are going to ship into that, sort of let you see more visually what's going on. And because we can't just add borders to grid items at the moment, you kind of need a tool if you want to be able to see where the grid is, because you can't just like have a nice red border around everything or whatever.
Last question from the audience, that because everything is too easy, can we have grids inside grids?
Well, removed from the spec. In the level 1 spec, there was a definition for subgrid, because at the moment, things have to be a direct child to become a grid item. The sort of ideal would be that you could define an overall grid, and then the children and the children's children, or whatever, can also lay out on the same grid. That was in the spec. It turned out to be incredibly complicated, and no one really knew quite how best to implement it. It's been moved to level 2, but I know people really care about that, because what we don't want to do is to end up kind of flattening out markup in order to use grid. You can nest a grid, so you can have a grid item can become a grid container itself, but that child grid currently doesn't have any relationship to the outer grid. So you're going to have to do a bit of working out if you want things to line up. But hopefully at some point we will get subgrid. I think it's really important. And on my site there's various things I've written about subgrid and why I think that it's something that we need.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I could always listen to you for hours, because your slides are like a training course. Like, and now we learned this, and now we learned this, and I dare all of you not to know it now. That's terrible, because you wasted her time. But yeah, go to the grids by example. There's basically everything there that Rachel gives out, and I want to thank you for being so open with that as well, and not like, here's my book, buy it. And it's great to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.